Hello, I'm Emily Barker. Welcome to a Unions New South Wales Workers' Comp update with Emma Maiden. Emma, there have been lots of changes. Let's start with the journey claims.
Yeah, well, journey claims are your trip to and from work, and for over 60 years those claims were always covered in our workers' comp system in New South Wales. But what happened in June when the O'Farrell government introduced the new workers' comp legislation is they just cut out coverage of journey claims completely. So if you were injured in a trip to and from work before the 19th of June this year, then you would be covered by the workers' comp system. But if you were injured to or from work after the 19th of June 2012, then you're just not covered for those trips in your car, on the bus, on the train, or walking to and from work. And we always felt that those journeys were an important part of the working process. You were only doing that journey because you're on your way to work, and so it's important that that be covered. But unfortunately, people that are injured that way, and we're getting lots of calls already from people who are being injured in car parks, they're just not covered. Now, at the time, the government said they made an amendment and they said, we will cover those trips if there's a real and substantial connection with work. But the way those words are going to be interpreted is going to be very narrow, and it really will only cover circumstances where someone might detour on their way to work to pick up, say, a part for their boss, or if
it was clearly connected to
very
their job.
Clearly connected. And there'll need to be test cases run to really interpret what that means over time. But we're certainly not confident that having that amendment to include the real and substantial connection with work is enough to include even a tiny proportion of journey claims. So that's a real shame. That's gone now for New South Wales.
What about changes to weekly payments?
Well, again, big cuts here. Previously what happened was you would get your normal wage for the first 6 months, and then you would reduce down to a lesser amount of money. But given that most workers get back to work within the first 2 weeks, that wasn't a problem for the majority of people. Now what's happening is right from the beginning, you reduce to 95% of your wage for the first 13 weeks, and then after 13 weeks, you're on to 80% of your wage, up to 2.5 years. Now, if you happen to be in a situation where you are working 15 hours a week, you can maintain that 95% of your wage up to 2.5 years. But for most people, 2.5 years is the absolute maximum they'll get workers' comp. Whereas previously you could go right through to retirement on a small amount of money, but still something to cover some of those expenses. So now most people will be off at 2.5 years. There is a small ability to extend that to 5 years, but only if you're quite severely injured. And then after the 5 years, you're only eligible for payments if you've got 20% whole person impairment, which is a very, very severe injury indeed, and you'd only see half a dozen to a dozen of injuries of that magnitude every year. So you're going from a system where people were protected or had some level of benefit for their entire working lives to where most of them are going to be off, cut off weekly benefits at 2.5 years.
What about medical payments?
Well, again, this is another area of massive change. Previously, you had your medical payments covered for as long as you had medical costs that were associated with your injury. Of course, only reasonable medical costs were covered. But now what happens is you get those medical costs covered while you're on weekly payments plus a year. So if you never have weekly payments, for example, if say you've got industrial deafness, you never actually have any time off work, you just have a severe hearing problem, you need to perhaps have expensive hearing aids, then you get it a year after you've had that injury discovered, and then you're on your own. And those hearing aids need to be replaced, every 5 years or so. There's quite expensive batteries and other things, and really when through no fault of their own the worker has been injured, those medical costs should be covered by workers' comp, and that's just not going to happen anymore.
I do understand there have been some changes to legal costs that have been positive.
Well, originally what was going to happen is legal costs were going to be borne by whoever took the legal action, and we were very unhappy about that, and an amendment went through at the last minute from Fred Nile that made it even worse, in the sense that it meant that workers would have to cover their own legal costs, and there wasn't any ability, even if they won their case, to recover those costs. That part of the legislation was actually put on hold for a while. There were a lot of negotiations, a lot of lobbying. And what's ended up happening is the government has set up a body, an independent body called ILARS, and it's actually funding the legal costs of workers through a process. So it is a different system. It's certainly not as good as what happened before, but it's a substantial improvement on what was going to happen with the amendment proposed by Fred Nile. And so I think for most workers, when they have an injury at work, either their union or themselves will go to a lawyer, and the lawyer will be able to get that funding to give them that initial representation.
And are these changes retrospective?
Well, that's another thing we heard at the time. I believe the Premier said that they weren't retrospective, but that just isn't true. Workers that were injured as at June, when the legislation went through Parliament, are definitely covered by these changes. So for those workers that were already injured, actually right up until the 1st of October this year, they are being transitioned onto the new system from the 1st of January next year. So their weekly payments will begin to be affected from the 1st of January 2013. And so they will have their weekly payments reduced. They will have their medical payments cut off at some point. And if they were a journey claim, obviously it depends whether it happened before or after the 19th of June. So it definitely is retrospective, and the one thing that isn't retrospective is the legal costs. So if you were already in the system before the 1st of October, you get to stay on the old legal cost system.
Okay, well, just finally, can you recap the main issues that affect working people in New South Wales?
Yeah, there's big reductions in weekly payments, big as a cap after 1 year on medical costs, and there's no more journey cover, a benefit that workers in New South Wales have enjoyed for over 60 years. So it's a huge reduction in those rights for injured workers, and it's really going to impact on people when really in their time of need and their families.
Well, Emma, thank you for the update, and of course for more information you can go to newsouthwalesforall.org.au.